2.
Alright, welcome to another episode of Nick's House. I'm Nick.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Jordan.
And we're here to talk about an interesting part of American history, probably one of the more dramatic parts of early American history. This is the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears. I wanted to open up with a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a very famous poet that lived in this time period. He wrote a letter to President Martin Van Buren imploring him to not take action as the sitting president in what we would later call the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act. He said to him, "The piety, the principle that is left in the United States, if only in its coarsest form, a regard to the speech of men, forbid us to entertain it as a fact. Such a dereliction of all faith and virtue, such a denial of justice, and such deafness to screams for mercy were never heard of in times of peace and in the dealing of a nation with its own allies and wards, since the earth was made. Sir, does this government think that the people of the United States are become savage and mad? From their mind are the sentiments of love and good nature wiped clean out. The soul of man, the justice, the mercy that is the heart in all men from Maine to Georgia does abhor this business. I write thus, sir, to inform you of the state of mind these Indian tidings have awakened here, and to pray with one voice more, that you, whose hands are strong with the delegated power of 15 millions of men, will avert with that might the terrific injury which threatens the Cherokee tribe. With great respect, sir, I am your fellow citizen, Ralph Waldo Emerson." This builds or frames the sentiment of the members of the United States that were not of the Indian tribes who opposed this Indian Removal Act. So the year is 1838. It's approximately 346 years from first contact between European settlers, Spanish, British, etc., and Native Americans. We now have just recently introduced Louisiana, Indiana, Mississippi, Illinois, and Alabama as states in the Union. Andrew Jackson has been elected in the year 1829. And currently we see five tribes, which will be called the 5 civilized tribes. These are the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and the Seminole, who were all living as autonomous sovereign nations, existing in what we now refer to as the American Deep South. So these were sovereign groups that had their own borders, had their own cultures, farms, schools, written languages, constitutions, governing documents for their nations. The clash happened with American settlers, citizens of the United States, who lived outside of these borders and began encroaching precipitously into native lands. This obviously began to cause a lot of conflict, and the white settlers began pressuring the federal government to remove these tribes and forfeit and cede the land to the growing American citizen population. Many opposed this sentiment, along with Ralph Waldo Emerson, to include Congressman Davy Crockett, congressman from Tennessee, who, although spent his earlier years fighting Native Americans, came to battle for them, in favor of them, on Capitol Hill, which is the hill that he politically died on after opposing Andrew Jackson and the predominant sentiment that was circulating in Washington. The Supreme Court ends up ruling in favor of the Cherokee after a citizen named Sam Worcester, who was an American citizen that was residing in Cherokee lands, conducting missionary work. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the sovereignty of the Cherokee tribe, and Sam Worcester was actually convicted to prison for 4 years. And Andrew Jackson was not going to be following what the Supreme Court ruling said.
Was he put in prison as a political prisoner, basically, or?
Yeah, I don't know the details of his imprisonment,
okay,
but he did suffer for his conviction.
For his support. Wow.
Yeah, suffered pretty badly, actually. Andrew Jackson decided to refuse or reject the ruling from the Supreme Court and instead tried to use the Treaty of New Echota as a justification for taking over the lands. Now, this Treaty of New Echota is very, very interesting because it was a treaty signed by a minority of Cherokee who did not represent the main leadership of the tribe, and it was not signed by the head chief, John Ross. But Jackson used it anyway. It was all he needed, and so the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act unfoiled afterwards. So, John, were you gonna, or no, Jordan, you were gonna speak a little bit to Andrew Jackson and the Removal Act?
It's kind of like revisiting the details he said, so I'll go over it real quickly.
Okay.
But so, and just a little bit about Andrew Jackson. He was a president of the United States, in case you weren't aware.
The seventh.
The seventh president. He'd already had a long history and a big reputation for being a proponent for clearing the native populations to make way for the new American experiment. So he had fought wars in 1814, 1815, 1818, fighting the Seminoles in Florida. And then it was actually through that actually led to Spain selling Florida to the U.S. in 1819, because they were like, oh, they saw how the U.S. Army was performing there, and they were like, oh, we can't defend this place, let's get rid of it. So he also helped negotiate treaties in 1814 and 1824 that started shifting the Native American populations west. So the idea was to get them out of like the East Coast areas, like the Carolinas and Deep South and everything. And because at this time the U.S. was just exploding in population and wealth. It was its population by this time was about 12 million people, and it was a country that had hardly existed for more than 100 years tops, and it had already become one of the largest countries in the world. So there's already a lot of pressure and a lot of complicated pressures. So he gets elected 1828, and shortly after that he starts to develop the Indian Removal Act. It's not like everybody in the U.S. was cool with this Indian Removal Act. It was very, very bitterly debated in Congress. So it was extremely controversial. Just as controversial as any modern day issue, like say abortion, or less recently the Emancipation Proclamation. It was super, super, super controversial. But they had the political force. There were enough pressures, and they passed the Removal Act on May 26, 1830. So supposedly it would lead to these voluntary treaties with these nations, but because of the pressures and the population disparity, so the entire native population at this time, it's hard to get exact estimates because it's just hard to get numbers from that era in history. But it was probably only about 100,000 native people
in this region.
In this particular region, yeah, compared to
South.
A population of about 12 million for the USA. So there's already just a massive population disproportion. So it was really so these tribes are under a lot of pressure, political pressure, to sign these treaties. So they seem voluntary on paper, but when you look at the circumstances, their hands were really forced. This act that was passed in 1830 was followed by the the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek a few months later, September 27, 1830. There's another treaty that Nick mentioned, the Treaty of New Echota, I guess?
Echota,
1835, which led to the Trail of Tears, which Jonathan is going to talk about. The Seminoles in Florida, they actually put up a big fight, and this led to a second Seminole War from 1835 to 1842. But by about 1837, Andrew Jackson had succeeded in removing about 46,000 Native Americans from land east of the Mississippi River, and a lot of them were settling in places like Oklahoma. So, and I'm gonna pass it on to Jonathan, the Trail of Tears.
Real quick, so that we aren't talking past each other. Nick, you mentioned the 5 civilized tribes, which I know a lot of Native Americans today kind of blanch at that term because they they were civilized in the sense that they were more amenable to
white culture.
Yeah, white culture, sure. But you listed Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Muskogee, and Seminole. That's 6. I didn't find anything on the Muskogee. Were they possibly like a half tribe? Or
Cherokee, like, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole. That's 5.
So you don't have Creek? Is that?
Oh no, I don't have Creek on my list.
So
did I miss that?
No. I'm curious. Maybe the Creek. I really don't.
I believe the Creek had been almost pretty much wiped out. Mm-hmm. Andrew Jackson actually had a part in that. Mm-hmm.
Well, interesting. 20,000 of them moved in the Trail of Tears. So, anyway.
Okay.
So the 5 nations that in the research that I did that at least the largest tribes that moved all moved at various times. The earliest removal happened with the Choctaw, and every single one of these tribes that we talk about took along with them slaves, the actual black slaves. Whether that I could find, the Seminole were the only ones that had fugitive freed slaves, and Seminole tribe was actually they had kind of rebranded themselves as they were running away, refusing to cooperate. So of the civilized tribes, they would have to be the least civilized in the term that is being applied here. They went down to Florida to kind of hide out amongst the Spanish and kind of seemed to be playing one side against the other.
Who's the they you're speaking?
The Seminoles.
Oh.
And the Seminole, the name of the new tribe that was formed due to their running away from dealing with all of this, actually means runaway. And so they also attracted a lot of runaway slaves to them, which was pretty interesting. But so one thing that I kept trying to do is trying to figure, there were some intelligent, arguably compassionate people who seemed to be on the side of removal. And I was trying to think, how would you, how would they defend this? And I didn't find any robust defenses of it from the era. But the Seminole in Florida, who kept conducting raids in American territory, would be akin to us going into Pakistan to kill Osama bin Laden in non-judicial killing. Basically, we felt like the Spanish were harboring terrorists that were attacking us on our soil, and they just wanted them out. Now, clearly, the Seminole thought they had more of a right to the soil than either the Spanish or the Americans, but in the frustration was akin to us in the war against terror, of being attacked by individuals who are being harbored by a larger society or national entity. So anyway, that's just I'm not arguing for that, but I think that a lot of maybe Pakistanis would be happy to hear that likeness, because they might feel the same way about some of the stuff we've done in the war on terror.
I've got a comment for that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. Okay. Yeah. So I'll jump into it.
Go through your Trail of Tears. We'll talk later.
Yeah. Okay. So so the first was the Choctaw, and the major years of emigration were 1831 to 1836, and total number emigrated or forcefully removed were 12,500. The number that stayed in the southeast was 7,000, and there were somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 deaths to cholera and other mishaps in transit. So that's just the Choctaw. Then there was the Creek. I won't list all the numbers for them, but there were about 22,000 total population with 900 black slaves. The Chickasaw, there were about 5,000 of them with about 1,000 black slaves. And then the largest was the Cherokee, almost 2,000 of them with 20,000 with 2,000 black slaves, and they had the largest number of deaths. And most people, when they think of the Trail of Tears, they think specifically of the Cherokee removal. However, the term Trail of Tears actually came from the not from the Cherokee removal, but shuffle. From the, well, I'll find it as we go on, but I believe it was the Choctaw removal, the first removal, and when they arrived in the yes, it was the Choctaw, and when they arrived in Oklahoma, they were asked by a reporter, one of the chieftains was asked, how was it, or something akin to that, and he responded, a trail of tears and death, and that was short to Trail of Tears, and again, most people think of that in conjunction with the largest of the removals of the Cherokee. And one interesting thing, a lot of the, this was not all removal through trackless wilderness. They had to go through a lot of small tribes. The various tribes, most of them were accompanied by armed guards, which was presumably for their defense against thieves or other tribes that might try to attack them. But it was pretty much them being pushed along at the end of a musket or the flintlocks that they had. And the cost to the United States government was pretty massive. So people who were against it, a lot of them weren't even against it for bleeding heart reasons. They just didn't think that so much money should be expended. And there was lots of reference to the fact that white settlers had to make similarly grueling trips without any government funding. At the same time, they were not being forced to do that, and their homes and belongings were not being burned back at home, which happened again with the Cherokee. They had really been resisting. They didn't want to leave, but when the government decided to enforce the Treaty of New Echota, they had no time at all. Armed troops came and said, "You're leaving right now," and some people left without even putting shoes on. And they moved slowly enough as they processed out of their camp that they were able to see greedy Georgian, mostly gold miners, who had been agitating the government to force them out of the land so that the Georgian miners could get at the gold deposits that they were after, burning and looting their things.
It's horrible. Just
yeah,
awful.
And so
disgusting.
One of the one of the most difficult things after the Trail of Tears itself was completed was the fact that the government did not own a lot of the lands that they were being resettled into. These were, in most cases, homes to the Plains Indians, and the Plains Indians were not interested in sharing their land. So there was quite a bit of death due to clashes that came between tribes when suddenly whole new tribes showed up and said, "Hey, we were told we could get some land," and there were even cases of the same tribe fighting itself when I believe it was the Cherokee tribe that some early adopters of the idea of removal had moved out west years earlier, and when finally the forced removal came, the tribes had grown so different, and they didn't even feel like they were kin, and so they had some squabbles and would refuse to allow the newer settlers to settle in the same area. So it was all around very rough. And the last thing I think that I'll have to say is the Cherokee were the most, quote unquote, most civilized of the 5 civilized tribes. In 1821, they put their language down in writing. They had their own newspaper. They had, as I said, they had 2,000 slaves among their 22,000 Indians that were moving west. They had, many of them fully adopted all of the trappings of the white man, and some of them even funded their own travel, even though it was mandatory. When the rubber met the road, they said, "Hey, I have money. I'm going to buy a steamship." Some of them actually went by water. They bought their own steamships, and they took hundreds of their household along with them, free and slave. And
we may as well.
We're
being
forced.
So, quick question.
Yes.
You said there was one slave for every 10 Cherokee.
Well, I'm guessing that there was probably an upper crust stratum.
Right.
Very
No, I'm
wealthy
just saying that I think it's a higher rate of slave ownership than Caucasian.
Not in the South. At this time, the population of whites in the South was really low too.
Oh, okay.
And there were more black slaves than there were free whites
Okay.
in the South.
Okay,
I believe,
that makes sense. Yeah.
So it was probably a somewhat similar ratio.
Okay.
But and I won't, since I've been talking too long, I won't get into all of it now. But the two name, or the one name that you mentioned, John Ross, and then his one-time nemesis, the Ridge. So they were two competing leaders, and to a modern eye, if you had to look at them, I think that just at the surface level, modern sympathies would instantly go to the Ridge, or he who walks on mountains. So from here on out, I'm just going to call him the Ridge or Ridge. But his Cherokee name translated to he who walks on mountains. He spoke almost no English. He was a warrior for his tribe until he was convinced of the ways of the settlers, the white settlers, and he still wore full Indian garb and had committed a pretty large degree of respect because of his past as a chieftain during wartime with the Cherokee. John Ross was an Irish dude with blue eyes and red hair who spoke no Cherokee.
He was half, right?
He was 1/7.
Oh, 1/7.
He was 1/7. He was raised by, I believe, his Irish mother, and he likely spoke with an Irish accent.
I thought it was his father, but yeah, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, and in your telling, Nick, he was the one that was the true leader. That I could not. He had more people behind him when it came down to the forced removal, but it was not a decided fact that he was the leader. As I said, he spoke no Cherokee, and so he needed a translator whenever he was speaking with the tribe. Anyway, the rivalry between the two of them became so intense that the tribe more or less split. John Ross accused the Ridge of treason, which was an official term, which was punishable by death under Cherokee law, and he was murdered shortly thereafter.
Pretty serious.
Due to the accusation that John Ross brought against him. And that's why I was asking you guys earlier. It was basically a fatwa. It was this verbal binding judgment that he was passing on the Ridge, which led to his murder and the murder of his son-in-law. And the rift that came from that murder and that disagreement of how the tribe was going to be run extended all the way until the Civil War, in which these two factions of the Cherokees, the John Ross faction fought with the North, and the Ridge faction fought with the South. They were actually Cherokee divisions killing each other during the Civil War because of what happened here.
That was something something interesting that I learned, was that how all these tribes were split. Mm-hmm. There were hundreds of tribes, and some of them fought for the South, some of them fought for the North. Mm-hmm. And it's crazy just how diverse they are. They aren't a monolith.
So anyway, I think that we should start talking after this short quote. I'm going to read. This is from Private John G. Burnett. He was captain in Captain Abraham McClellan's company, 2nd Regiment, 2nd Brigade, Mounted Infantry, and he was part of the Cherokee Indian removal from 1838 to 1839. This is his first-hand account of some of the terrible things that he saw on the path. So this gives you an idea of what it was like on the ground. On the morning of November 17th, We encountered a terrific sleet and snowstorm with freezing temperatures, and from that day until we reached the end of the fateful journey on March 26th, 1839, the sufferings of the Cherokees were awful. The trail of the exiles was a trail of death. They had to sleep in the wagons and on the ground without fire, and I have known as many as 22 of them to die in one night of pneumonia due to ill treatment, cold, and exposure. Among this number was the beautiful Christian wife of Chief John Ross. This noble-hearted woman died a martyr to childhood, giving her only blanket for the protection of a sick child. She rode thinly clad through a blinding sleet of snow and storm, developed pneumonia, and died in the still hours of a bleak winter night, with her head resting on Lieutenant Gregg's saddlebag. And he recorded this many years later. I believe it was in his 80s. He was interviewed, and that's where this quote comes from. And from the way that he describes it, it seems clear that he is haunted by what he was a part of and what he witnessed. And so, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Heavy.
Wow.
Heavy
Stuff, for sure. It's one of those things when you look at American history and you're just like, what the hell were we thinking? And that's also, I think
it's a human thing. It's a human, the classic human problem of, oh, they got something, I want it. Because like the way the American settlers, the American citizens viewed the natives was, they're not using the land for what it could be used. A lot of people use that argument. They said, there's gold out there, there's ore, there's all kinds of resources. They're not tapping into any of that because they don't seem to be that interested in it. I think if they would have been allowed time, they probably would have begun those technologies and extracting everything. They'd already started to adopt, like you said, the culture of the white man, which is funny because the slave concept is like, they have slaves and that's actually like a thing. It's anachronistic for us to go, oh, slavery, well, that's awful. Yeah, but that's what everyone did back then. So they were just adopting the common practice, therefore becoming civilized, quote unquote, in the eyes of.
Or maybe they just wanted slaves. Maybe they just wanted free labor.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a natural thing. It's like learning the alphabet. It's like starting to wear American style clothes. Like it's just gonna start to, seep in and bleed in.
Well, so Andrew Jackson complained that the U.S. had been trying to get the native populations to integrate for 30 years. It was at that point, in his mind, it had been a 30-year issue. I'm trying to think of a 30-year issue. Oh, an equivalent one. Roe v. Wade just turned 30 a few years ago. Mm-hmm. So just think about how long that's been an issue. I mean, that's sort of how it was at the time of Andrew Jackson. By the time this act was passed.
Yeah. Whereas Jefferson told the natives, we know that you can become like us. We can interbreed, we can intermarry, we'll become one great people. But it didn't work the way he envisioned that well.
I like to think about, like, okay, so I don't want to be controversial. This is honestly me just being curious and having a thought experiment, but is it possible that the native populations were being immoral and the way that they were handling the land and not working with the millions of new immigrants that were pouring into the country?
I don't know where you're getting that from. Like, what do you mean?
Like,
what do you mean immoral?
Are you saying maybe they needed to learn that this was our land, this is your land?
No, I'm not. I'm not saying no. I'm not.
Let's mingle, guys. Let's mingle.
I'm not making an argument over any type of superior civilization.
No.
Because I'm wondering if they had a moral imperative to allow the world just to change as things were going.
Okay, well, where my mind goes when I hear you say that is, there certainly seems to be a faction in America that thinks we have a moral imperative in America to allow anybody to come in who wants to. Mm-hmm.
And it's going to help foster the manifest destiny, which many held to. Not everyone, but...
Oh, I mean, I'm saying like currently...
You're saying in modern
times.
Like, So, typically the left of the political spectrum today, just like Jordan is saying, would say that we have a moral imperative to allow anybody to come into our country.
Yeah.
So those would be the same people probably who would be most critical of us trying to come into Indian
Ironically
territory. That is.
So you're saying you would be like in that time period, you want to look at it through a liberal lens, or
well, okay, so
judge it through a liberal
in
lens?
Andrew Jackson's speech, he was the progressive. He was the progressive in that case. He was progressing civilization in his mind. He was the progressive.
I think that's wordplay. Like, he was progressive. He was being tyrannical.
He was progressive. You have to realize, like, what we call progressive is continually evolving.
Okay, yeah. I mean,
So,
it's a loaded word.
Yeah, it's a loaded word. I mean, but that was progress. It was the progress to civilization.
It was.
And in his mind,
expansion, but it wasn't.
In
like,
his mind,
moral progress, though.
In his mind, these holdouts, air quotes here, these holdouts were impeding progress.
Expansion. Yeah, but not moral progress. Just technological expansion.
In his mind, like reading his speech, he sees himself, at least the way he's spinning it, he's like, I'm doing a favor to these uncivilized natives. He probably didn't have a southern accent. He's probably very, very highly educated and refined, but
he was from Tennessee, I think, right?
Oh, maybe he did have that accent. But,
think of Tennessee, maybe.
But my point is, though,
right?
And I'll fight anyone who argues with me. In his mind, he was a progressive. He was progressing civilization. I'm not saying that's a good thing.
No, I take issue with using the word progressive. I think he was. Maybe he thought he was progressive. Sure, I agree with you on that. But he certainly wasn't behaving in a morally progressive manner.
Right.
He was behaving in a tyrannical manner. Supreme Court rules, and he just goes, nah. Like, come on, by anyone's measure, that's like, it's the Supreme Court. Like, why do you have it if you're just gonna like cast it aside, right?
Executive orders.
Yeah. That's another conversation, right?
Among the 5 tribes that we were talking about, the Seminoles actually got the best deal for their land, because I believe the way that it worked is that the full expenses of the travel were paid for by the federal government, and then 1 year's worth of expenses in the new place of arrival was paid for. But I think that basically came from the sale of their land, the forced sale of their land that they were leaving. They were being paid off for their land. But the Seminoles actually got not a great deal. It was still well below market value. But the Seminoles, we had bought the land from Spain, but then we couldn't claim it because the Seminoles were still in Florida. And they fought tooth and nail until the federal government was forced to actually deal with them as almost equals at the negotiating table and say, all right, how much do you want?
That's
and they still did not get market value, but they got much better money. And then the same thing happened to them. Then they were forced to leave, but at least they got more money out of the deal. Which it's
they
interesting.
Got a football team named after them.
They did.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, that reminded me of what you said earlier, the Pakistan, the analogy you used in Pakistan. I get what you're saying with it, but I think it falls short in how you laid it out. Is like if we went into Pakistan, did Osama bin Laden raid and all that. It's like, well, that's Pakistan's land, though. Like, that's their area. We went in without, asking permission, etc. I think the whole concept of this, and this is probably just the reason I fundamentally stand where I do on this topic generally, is hundreds of millions of natives lived in North America prior to the white man arriving. Okay, the white man arrives and it's like, oh, land, I'll just go ahead and take it. And it's like that decision right there, whether it wasn't like necessarily a singular conscious decision, but it happened, it has consequences. It had massive consequences, and then so that cascade over the next 400, 500 years of all this drama and tragedy, and you can say, well, there was times when the natives were fighting against the settlers, and the settlers had to respond, and if you take pocketed events and you say, wow, it looks like those natives are being really brutal to those whites, and those whites were just sitting there farming, like, that's messed up. But it's like, it all precipitated from this singular event of this culture coming across the ocean, landing there and saying, here's our flag. We're gonna stick it in here, and then we're just gonna keep spreading. I mean, you're gonna have clash.
Who did that? Where was that singular decision made?
I said it. I didn't say it was a singular decision. I said it happened precipitously from Europe. Europeans come over because they want to expand into new lands, right?
I mean, but a lot of the tribes initially, after the ravages of smallpox and the like had kind of died down, were happy to have trading partners. And
sure, I mean, eventually it's going to settle out, but
a lot of the places that were settled at first either were sparsely inhabited or they didn't even know were inhabited. Some of them were seasonal hunting grounds or camping grounds of the Indians, and so a lot of them were living there for a while before they ever encountered the natives. And then when they did, it's not like the natives were like, you need to get out. They were just like, oh my gosh, what the heck. And
the problem became when here's the singular problem with it is that the culture of the white Europeans was land ownership. We come in, this is my land now, and it's like on contract. The natives don't have a concept of this, so that mentality clashes into theirs, where you had instances where the natives are making deals, peaceful deals with white settlers, like, okay, you guys want to live on this land and set up your white man cottage and farm, okay, but can we still hunt? These are our hunting lands. And then the whites are like, yeah, sure, dude, no problem. But then what happens over the next few years is natives go in to hunt on that land, and a white man comes up with a musket and is like, what are you doing on my land, red man? You know, and then they're like, whoa, I thought this was part of our treaty. Like, we can still hunt here. You can live here. You know. Anyway, my point is that I mean, it's just like everything else in history. There's consequences to events, right? And so the white man's culture coming over is going to cause what we,
white man culture isn't
European.
It's
culture.
not a monolith. I love saying this. It's not a monolith.
Contract law, land ownership, all of that is going to become a problem for the natives.
I don't grant the premise that the natives didn't have a concept of land ownership. There were lots of tribes that if they ever saw an Apache on their land, they'd shoot him. Or if I mean, so it just was the only difference in your description is that they weren't able to codify in writing, and that's just because they didn't have writing. Which if you're going to argue against writing as a logos-centered culture as being a bad thing,
I didn't say it was a good or a bad thing.
Okay,
I said there's consequences to the clash of the mentality.
Yeah, I don't think it's accurate to say that they didn't have a concept of land ownership either. I don't think
they didn't have a concept of the legality of contract law of we own this land. And then when those treaties are made,
I think it was more of a might makes right type thing in a lot of situations. Maybe they're not going to sit in a room and all sign a paper saying that Red Cloud owns this little plot of land, but they are going to be like, if Red Cloud sees someone on his land, he's going to shoot him or whatever. You know, maybe it's not a written. I mean, I'm not well versed in native law at all, but I'm sure they had concept of land ownership, just maybe not expressed in the way that Western culture tends to.
These things were established through treaties, over 500 treaties between natives and whites over the centuries, between the United States and natives, I should say. Every one of those treaties, at one point or another, was violated by the United States.
Right.
So this I have a quote here from Alexis de Tocqueville. This is from his Democracy in America, published in 1835. He firsthand witnessed the Choctaw removal in 1831. He was a very deep thinker. This was essentially his PhD that he wrote abroad in America. A lot of people might take issue with the wording that he chooses, but I'm going to go ahead and read the quote. The savage is his own master as soon as he is able to act. Parental authority is scarcely known to him. He has never bent his will to that of any of his own kind, nor learned the difference between voluntary obedience and a shameful subjection.
So he was a libertarian?
And the very name of law is unknown to him. To be free with him signifies to escape from the shackles of all the shackles of society, as he delights in this barbarous independence and would rather perish than sacrifice the least part of it. Civilization has little power over him. And so he was making the argument that it was just impossible for native culture to coexist, like you were saying, with a culture that needed laws that stood for all time. And I think that the biggest betrayal to the Native Americans was when a lot of them started saying, okay, we're going to play by your rules, and they would start signing treaties, and then we would not live up to our own. When we started becoming hypocrites and we said, hey, you need to live by a standard of law, and we would make law with them through treaty and then not enforce our own treaties on our own people, because when it came down to it, the government was much more responsive to people who had vote than people who didn't have a vote.
The election cycle.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a new election cycle.
Yeah.
I guess we're going to change. Oh, we're not going to follow those treaties that last dude made.
So I asked this question before we started recording, but so these native nations, they had formal borders, correct? Were they countries, so to speak?
The Supreme Court
Could you
ruled
think of
that
them as countries?
they were sovereign nations that had the right, just as any other interaction
Right.
between. If the United States were to invade Japan, it's a problem, right?
So
You have to-
the problem was that the native nations couldn't get the political unity to fight an encroaching political force. So they were unable to defend themselves.
No. The Supreme Court rules in their favor. That's all the political might
That's
you
what
need.
the law says, but I'm saying, setting the law aside, when rubber meets the road, they just didn't have the capacity.
Yeah, they had Davy Crockett, a handful of people that are like, hey, let's not do this, guys, it's wrong. Supreme Court said it's wrong. And then Jackson strong arms it with effectively an executive order, right? Which is a whole other concept in and of itself, like the power of the executive branch. Which is a tyrannical move. But Jefferson justified it by saying, hey, like, white people all the time give up their land to go to a better place. We should go ahead and force these natives to go west of the Mississippi. It's a better place. It's like, it's one thing to voluntarily leave England for a better life.
Right, yeah.
It's another thing to force someone at gunpoint to go have a better life.
Yeah, so that's definitely wrong. One thing we can all agree on is that the methods that the U.S. used to obtain those lands were terribly, horribly, brutally wrong.
Yeah.
Absolutely, like, unquestionable.
And Jefferson was a bad man.
So the problem is that reality tends to overshadow the other part of this discussion, is that what should have happened? I mean, I think
Supreme Court ruling should have stood. Those nations should have been allowed to either flourish or fall apart of their own volition, just like any other sovereign nation. And the whites should respect those borders and that ruling by the Supreme Court of their government.
I guess it was just too tempting for all these entrepreneurs, that all that land just sitting there, they just couldn't resist it.
I've thought a lot
All
about
that gold.
All that gold.
I've thought a lot about what should have happened, what would have been a good outcome, because it is hard to think of the entire or huge swaths of the Deep South just being still inhabited by
for us now, it's hard to
it's
imagine.
really just baffling. Try to think. Imagine that is tough. And so
we'd have no Auburn Roll Tide, man.
My grandmother was obsessed with Native culture when I was growing up, and I knew next to nothing about the history of Native American relations with the federal government. But as a kid, every little thing that I learned about Native culture depressed me, because I just thought, who would ever want to live in a culture where you didn't have video games, where there were common food shortages, where you never have a surplus of food from year to year. Just like every single thing that I learned, I just couldn't comprehend how they didn't instantly just give up all their ways and say, okay, cool, you guys brought Mickey D's. But as I've grown older and I have learned the excesses and faults of my own culture, I think that and this is kind of trite and a truism, but I think there is so much that Western American culture could have learned from the Native Americans, and I think that that I don't have a definite answer for how it would have played out, but if respect for the other, to kind of use the buzzword, respect for the other would have won the day, and there would have been a true recognition that this person, even though he looks very different than me, is my fellow man. I think America would be a much better place, and I think the same thing applies with slavery. In the chapter that I read from Alexis de Tocqueville, it's actually, the name of the chapter is the future well-being of the three races in America. And he actually he doesn't separate the issues. He goes he talks about the way that the white man relates to the black slaves and also to the Native Americans, and he thinks that it's very tied, and it's a really interesting chapter. And he very much thinks that Western culture is going to win out because it has a lot of superiority in certain areas,
technology.
but he's also very on the side of these downtrodden peoples, and it's an interesting balancing act that he does to be able to kind of say both those
To
things.
explore that,
And none of us are of the illusion that slavery and bad things didn't occur amongst all kinds of groups of humans throughout history across the whole planet, to include the Native Americans. They enslaved each other, they killed each other, they warred with each other sometimes. So we're not trying to paint this like magical utopia.
Right.
But when it comes to, like John said earlier, the hypocrisy of this, quote, civilized American nation, with the treaty violations, the rejection by the executive branch of the Supreme Court ruling, those are big moments for our country. And I remember barely touching on this in school. I remember the phrase "Trail of Tears," but I don't remember us going very in depth into it. And I think it deserves a lot more attention because, like we know, if you need to understand history, understand the pattern, the different habits of different actors on each other. I actually found out in this study of all this that Adolf Hitler actually took some plays out of the playbook of the early American government in how they dealt with the natives. So we're talking about taking one group of people that are not your people and they're different, and moving them. And so he studied it, got some motivations or got some inspirations from these things. So it's not fun to talk about. It's, as being American citizens, we've served our country, to think, wow, we've had dark times in our past.
We need, and that's another really important point, is that we need to
acknowledge them.
We can't forget the stuff. We have to remember it. We have to remember it. We have to think about how were we able to justify this, because we don't want to repeat something like this. We just don't want to do that.
Unfortunately, we kind of did when the Japanese internment camps.
Yeah,
that's a whole nother out.
That wasn't as bad.
Right there.
I mean, that was bad. Don't get
that
me
was
wrong, but
definitely bad.
It's not like we didn't round them all
different
up
circumstances. But yeah. I wanted to get in there. Like, so Jefferson, I remember we said I didn't want to make this all about him, but he's just too juicy of a character, right? Like, he fought in a battle against the Creek Indians as a general before even becoming president, years and years before this, where the Cherokee were actually one of the groups that fought with him against the Creek Indians. So it's extra bad, it's extra awful that later he knifes the Cherokee in the back by doing this removal act, when some would argue this, but I would say that they saved his life at that day in that battle against the Creek Indian, because if it weren't for them, he would have lost, and he probably would have been killed or imprisoned by
he couldn't have been racist. He adopted a little Indian boy.
Oh yeah, so he's good.
He's good, right?
It's like people that get married.
Oh, and he said that he had friendly feelings for natives too. So obviously he felt friendly to them. So
he loves
could have
them.
been
He
racist.
appreciated their languages. I read a bunch of stuff about him, like adoring certain parts of their cultures and stuff. It's like, okay, falls on deaf ears. I'm sorry.
They had respect for him, even if it was just a fearful respect. He had several nicknames. Old Hickory was one. Big Knife was what the natives called him. Which is.
And Native Americans to this day refuse to carry $20 bills. They'd rather carry two $10 bills than a $20 bill, because he still is just bitter in their mouth.
I don't carry 20s either, because money is stupid and I like my credit card. But
I don't carry money because I don't have any.
Money's so weird.
So, okay,
Gold.
the native nations were not able to become cohesive enough to form enough political power to protect themselves.
I mean, they're a minority. They're not that
They're a
strong.
minority,
They don't have
but
technology.
slaves. I mean, slaves were a minority as well.
Yeah. They
But,
couldn't fight for themselves.
I mean, we don't have
politically.
slaves now. The Emancipation Proclamation happened because there was enough political force to have that all overturned.
Yeah, but it wasn't slaves that emancipated themselves. It was
Right.
The United States government came to its senses and was like, oh, this is wrong. Let's fix this. And finally saying, oh, that all men are created equal. Well, Thomas
they
Jefferson
said-
penned that.
They said that from the beginning. It's just they hypocritically
Right.
didn't live up to that.
I
We
didn't bring-
finally caught up to it.
I didn't bring any of the quotes that talked on this because it delved too much into slavery, but Tocqueville wrote about how if you were going to paint with a broad brush the attitude of natives versus slaves, it's completely dependent upon the way that they entered the American scene. So for the slaves, they came to a country where they had, most of them, never heard their native language spoken. They are constantly from the day that a man has a son, he is socially equal with his son. He will never progress beyond that unless it's through the eyes of his master. There's no self-driven or independent rising through the ranks. It's always going to come as a gift from the master. And because of that, he said that the dominating feature of slaves' approach towards white culture was aspiring to enter into it, to become higher in social status. But for the natives, they truly had to give up their culture. Their culture was not as effectively taken from them as it was from the slaves. So they still had their culture. If they wanted to become successful in American society, it meant getting rid of their ways. Because to win politically, a lot of them had lifestyles that you simply could not have a political life. I mean, a lot of them, their ideal was to father some children and then spend most of your life on the warpath or hunting. And so there was not an idea of this. There was a certain degree of cohesiveness in the 5 civilized nations where there was some attempts at working together, but
They were in their infancy, though.
Yeah.
And it was like, they're brand new, they're trying to learn these new concepts from the white man, and they're like, okay, let's see, things are changing, and let's kind of try to adapt. But they're stamped out before they're even allowed to become toddlers.
A fundamentally different way of thinking about the world and approaching society.
Well, it's might makes
It's like,
right. It's a might makes right.
You know what it makes you think of rural culture in the U.S. compared to city culture. In rural culture, it's all about self-reliance and independence, and you don't get city water, you don't get city sewage. Some people create their own electricity. They just want to be independent. Whereas if you live in a city or in a suburban area, you have to really cooperate.
Very
with people.
reliant.
Yeah.
But this is a might makes right situation because, like you said, they don't have political power because they're not yet fully capable of the politics of what the United States is using, right? They're really reliant on, in this case, Samuel Worcester. He goes to the Supreme Court and says, hey, Supreme Court, see these Cherokee, like they're having issues, make a ruling, and then they do make a ruling. But in the Cherokee, they start to learn, oh, Supreme Court, oh, file case, okay, but they're not even allowed to start to engender that stuff. They get stamped out by the mighty fist of Andrew Jackson, effectively the executive branch, before they're even allowed to flourish as a nation. But it's a moral question. It's like, might makes right in this situation. In Andrew Jackson's mind, he's like, we have the might, and that's why we're right. And they go in and they, at gunpoint, move them across the country.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that's, anyway, so, if you guys don't have anything else to say, I guess, we'll wrap this one up.
Yeah.
It's kind of a dreary one, but
yeah.
I found it extremely interesting. I love diving deep into the dark parts of the great nation of the United States because And like we said earlier, it's part of our genes as a nation, and we need to just accept the way history played out. Anything else, guys, to add?
Just, I think it's interesting that a lot of this culminated in the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like all the bloodshed that America had been engaging in, it became a victim of its own bloodiness. And hundreds of thousands of people died in the Civil War. And then ever since the Civil War, it hasn't been we haven't had as much genocide in the U.S. So that sounds terrible.
Knock on wood.
Knock on wood. Although some would argue that abortion counts as a genocide, which is a whole other topic right there.
Yeah, it's a
controversial
dicey
topic
one.
that's worth diving into at some point.
Yeah,
but
we definitely.
I think that the U.S. learned. We've learned from our mistakes to an extent. Not to say that we're perfect, but I understand why Colin Kaepernick needs. I just say that. I don't agree with him, but I understand why he does.
For sure. I mean, in our actions abroad, we still have a lot to learn. Clearly,
Yes.
the way we use our might in other places where people don't have the ability to really stand up and oppose us. You can just go right in, and that gets very, very hairy. But at least in this case, we can look back and look at the entire situation and say, okay, well, and that's what we just did. The rest is up to you. Make your own judgments on Andrew Jackson. Oh, he's definitely worth a look. He's probably worth an episode all unto himself.
Maybe someone will write a musical. Maybe some Puerto Rican guy will write a musical.
I'd watch that one. I'd definitely watch that one. Even the John Ross and Ridge, that whole altercation, that's very interesting. I highly recommend you look into their saga. And there's just so many stories. All right, well, that's it for us. Until next week or next time. This is Nick's house. I'm Nick.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Jordan.
Signing out. Bye.